to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Talking Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and I'm being joined today by Courtney Rickert McCaffrey, EY's Global Geostrategic Business Group Insights Leader. And today we're going to dive into the geopolitics and the impact it's having on the industry and the supply chain in particular. Courtney, welcome to this episode.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Before we get into this a little bit, some of our audience may not be familiar with you. Can you share a little bit of your background with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had more than 15 years of experience advising global corporate leaders on how to manage geopolitical risks and global macro trends more broadly. And really the emphasis that I focus on is around analyzing the strategic implications for companies and how they can actually proactively manage the risks that they face. So, in my current role, as you said, I provide sort of market leading insights around geopolitics and political risk management and geostrategy. I'm also the co-author of a recent book called Geostrategy by Design, which I co-authored with my colleague Oliver Jones at EY, and also Vice Dean Vitold Henisch from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yep. I'm imagining your job is very busy these days.
Yes, indeed.
As we're going to, I've done a number of episodes over this year on geopolitics. This seems to be a very hot topic and a very important topic for supply chains. And to be clear to the audience, we're not going to get into individual candidates. We're not going to get into their policies or anything like that today. We're just kind of going to use elections in general as kind of a basis for this broader discussion on geopolitics in the world. And I think generally speaking, when I talk to people, we tend to focus a lot on the upcoming election in the US that we have. But you mentioned on a recent episode of Bloomberg's The Close that about 60% of the world's GDP this year is held elections. So geopolitics, obviously, it's not just the US concern, right? It's not just the US CEO concern. It's a global phenomenon this year. I'm curious if you've had in conversations you've had with businesses this year, are they focused on what's happening globally, or are most businesses just kind of focused on what's in their own backyard?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, we've seen so many elections this year. As you said, it's about 60% of the world's GDP and over half of the world's population is voting just in 2024. So pretty amazing year. So what we're seeing is because a lot of companies and a lot of the companies we work with specifically have a global footprint in terms of their supply chain, their operation, their customers. We aren't really seeing them focus on just what's happening in their own backyards. Really, a lot of CEOs and C-suites more broadly are looking beyond what's happening in their own home markets to really try to track what's happening around the world with these elections and other geopolitical issues as well. So, it's something that we actually have data around. For instance, in our last CEO Outlook Pulse survey, more than a third of CEOs point to geopolitics as one of their top concerns for the coming quarters. So this is something that they're definitely focusing on. And we've seen, questions from clients around the world about a lot of those elections in markets around the world. So whether that's Indonesia, India, South Africa, the EU, now the US, we're really seeing a lot of C-suites around the world focus on all of those markets at once.
Yep. And so there is focus, and that's good to hear, I think, because when I talk to people just kind of talk about the U.S. election, right? And I've always wondered whether people are really paying attention to what's going on around the world. But it sounds like that actually is happening, which obviously is good. So one of the things that I've been told over the years, and my father told me this years ago, and I've heard it from other people as well, is that oftentimes businesses are not concerned about what the rules are they work under, but they want to know what those rules are, right? I mean, they want consistency in those rules so they're not changing every year. We have seen over the last decade and a half, I guess, a little more polarization in the world, not just in the US, in all countries, right? I mean, and some divergence with political parties around the world and what they're doing. I'm wondering, do you see, if you've been doing this a little while, so are you seeing the global environment become a little more volatile in that respect, or do we just have short memories? And I think most importantly on this question is, how do businesses account for some of these divergent views that are taking place and growing around the world?
Yeah, well, it's definitely been a really volatile time. I mean, people's memories do tend to be short, but in this case, I think that's a genuine that feeling is genuine and borne out in what we've seen in terms of trends in geopolitics. So really, since about the end, around the time of the global financial crisis till now, we've been in sort of an unsettled geopolitical environment. And then, just the past few years, it's sort of been supercharged, obviously, by the COVID pandemic, and some geopolitical conflicts around the world. We've had, high inflation, obviously a lot of innovation and technology. Some of this is outside the realm of geopolitics, but it all has implications for how sort of global politics works and how countries interact with each other. And as you mentioned, how people within countries are approaching their own political environments as well. So, what we've seen certainly is this era of really high volatility and maybe even more importantly, uncertainty about the future, because, as you mentioned, a lot of C-suite leaders really want predictability and certainty in the environment that they face. That's actually more important, as you point out, than maybe some of the specifics of what that environment is. So, going forward, what we've seen is, because of that uncertainty, a lot more C-suites and boards as well are turning to scenario analysis and tabletop exercises and other kinds of strategic foresight methodologies to try to kind of bound that uncertainty and get their arms around it and strategically position their company for a variety of outcomes, because it is really unclear where the world is heading from here or where any particular country is heading from here. So using scenarios and trying to plan for multiple outcomes, we see as something that a lot more CEOs and boards and others are using in this environment.
Yeah, I got a question on scenario planning. I want to get to that in a second, but before I do, I just want to ask you, what in the conversation you've had, what are you hearing? What are you seeing as kind of the biggest geopolitical risk? I mean, we've got elections, we've got trade concerns, right, around the world. We've got wars and conflicts going on in Europe, in the Middle East. What is the biggest issue that you're hearing and you're seeing from conversations you're having?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. I mean, it really does depend, obviously, on a company's home market, their global footprint, where their supply chains are, what sector they're in, and also their risk tolerance, right?
Yeah.
But I would say, over the past several years, there has been sort of one issue area that does seem to be top of mind for a lot of C-suites around the world, and that's sort of the geopolitical tensions and a lot of the trade and investment restrictions that have been put in place between some of the major economies in the world. So what we're seeing is, a lot of supply chain impacts in particular. I know you mentioned you've been talking about geopolitics on this podcast a lot this year, and that's no surprise given just how
Yep.
sort of in the crosshairs supply chain impacts are from a lot of these geopolitical developments. So we're seeing, industrial policies with governments trying to, onshore, nearshore, friendshore supply chains. We're seeing a lot of use of different trade policy tools like tariffs and export controls. And then, sort of related to that, some, investment screening and restrictions on cross-border investment as well. In addition, of course, to sanctions on certain markets and certain products. So, what we're seeing as a result of all of this is really a big focus from companies on these supply chain dynamics. And so what we're seeing is a lot of sort of attention to and desire to increase the resilience of companies' global supply chains. So government or companies are doing that in different ways, again, depending on sort of their footprint and their sector. But what we're seeing is, some looking at localization in different ways, some looking at kind of regionalization of supply chains. But really at the core, what is driving a lot of this is some of these geopolitical developments and sort of which sectors are more strategic to governments, which ones governments are trying to kind of reshore in different ways.
Yeah.
That's creating some challenges. There's also some opportunities around, expanding production capacity and supplier relationships in new markets, around sort of diversifying markets. So we're seeing a lot of activity in this space.
Yeah, it's funny. When I started out in my career 25 years ago as I'm a journalist by trade. So when I started in it, when I was in college, it was like, well, what do you want to do? And what I wanted to do was go into geopolitics, international relations, reporting because I found that fascinating, the way countries interacted with each other and whatnot. And then I landed eventually, I started in sports, landed in trucking and logistics, and now over to the broader supply chain. And so all this conversation about geopolitics this year is like take me back to where I was in college. Like this is what I wanted to do, right? In many
Well,
ways. So,
perfect.
so it's like I never thought I'd get to here, but and now I'm back doing it. But it's been fascinating about the number of inquiries and people that everybody's talking about this in
Mhm.
some way these days, much more so than I remember a few years ago, obviously. You mentioned a question or so ago about scenario planning. It's kind of a proactive approach to this, right? And with so much of this stuff going on, so many elections, so many different possibilities that exist out there, I'm curious whether scenario planning is even a worthwhile exercise still when there's so much variability there. And if it is, I'm assuming it probably is, but how do you go about doing that? Are there commonalities that you can see to say to make your scenario planning more productive, right? So that you're not doing a bunch of scenario planning you just have to throw out the window.
Yeah, that would not be very useful. You're absolutely right. We obviously can't plan for every scenario or every contingency,
Yeah.
but we still do find scenario planning as a worthwhile exercise for a lot of our clients. So, and again, we are seeing a lot more interest in this from C-suites and boards around the world. So I think there's a couple different approaches to scenario planning that we found useful. So one is, some of the companies that we work with are interested in developing scenarios or a set of scenarios around an acute geopolitical crisis, some potential risk that they're concerned about because of the outsized impacts that it would have on their company and their supply chains. So those types of scenarios are really about sort of pre-positioning for resilience. So identifying what they could change today, perhaps to create more resilience across a suite of potential scenarios related to that risk. And then it's also about creating, crisis management preparation and playbooks. So if something broadly similar to one of the scenarios that they thought through does happen in the future, they have a playbook. They know how to respond.
Yeah.
The other type of scenario analysis that we're seeing C-suites do is more around long-term trends for the future of globalization. So this is more about sort of when you're doing a corporate strategy refresh or thinking about supply chain network realignment in this geopolitical environment that we're in. So kind of thinking about not necessarily moves that need to be made today, but how to sort of plan for how the world could evolve in the future. And again, it's around identifying those actions or those strategies that you can take that would provide resilience across a variety of different potential scenarios. What we're also seeing is a lot of C-suites using tabletop exercises. So taking a specific scenario and then really sort of gaming it out with the entire C-suite around the table, virtual or physical table, and really kind of walking through how company leadership would respond to that particular scenario. Who would need to be involved in the decisions? How would those get made? On what time frame would those get made? And so what we're seeing with those especially is that it helps to build that muscle memory within the executive leadership team, so that to be able to respond to any crisis or risk in the future. So even if the exact scenario doesn't arise, the C-suite's still better able to handle what does come their way because they've kind of built those muscles,
Yeah.
and so they're able to adapt their supply chains or whatever it is more quickly to remain resilient.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's good. There are just too many, not just in geopolitics, but in general. I mean, there's too much going on in the world and too many different types of disruptions. I mean, even weather or whatever. We're seeing it down in Florida, right? As we're recording this, Hurricane Helene is bearing down on Florida. And I just don't know that you can plan for everything. I
No,
think that
absolutely not.
I mean that would be a whole team of people doing nothing but that,
Right.
and companies just can't afford that and whatnot. I wanted to go back. I wanted to shift a little bit. Go back to the interview that I watched with you with Bloomberg that you had done, and the host asked you a very interesting question. And I, given the time constraints of TV, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to ask if you kind of expand on it. And the question was whether the skill sets of CEOs was being changed today by geopolitical considerations. And I think traditionally CEOs came from the sales or revenue sides of the business. COVID, I think, changed that a little bit as executives kind of learned that supply chain managers have this ability to adapt to change quickly. And So I want to ask you, are you seeing a change? Are you seeing a change in the skill sets for CEOs? Are there particular skills that you're seeing now that are maybe more in demand? And I think importantly for our supply chain audience is this opening up new career opportunities for them? You know, is it giving supply chain professionals hope that there's something beyond the supply chain manager role that they're in now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I might frame it less as about skills, although I think skills is a component, and more about sort of mindset. So, as you mentioned, CEOs are now operating in this much more complex and uncertain environment than they did before. And all of that means, that they need to have the ability and the skills, and again, the mindset, to kind of set a clear strategic direction, but that also is, agile and can adapt to change quickly. And that also requires really close integration across the C-suite, including, supply chain managers and others, because it really is sort of a whole of enterprise um, task to be able to adapt to this complex and uncertain environment. So, as you pointed out, I think, chief operating officers, chief supply chain officers, and others in that space have been really in the spotlight in recent years and have really had to adapt very, very quickly to a lot of the supply chain disruptions that we've seen from, the pandemic, from wars, from some of those, policy restrictions on cross-border flows. Even sustainability, I would argue, kind of plays a role here. So,
Yeah.
given that, I do think it's possible we'll see more sort of people from the supply chain side of companies kind of transition into that CEO role in the coming years.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think diverse voices in the C-suite is really important, right? And I think
Mhm.
the C-suite's been dominated so much over the years by the sales and revenue sides of businesses that there's not necessarily the diversity of voices, that can make companies better.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, we see that across the board, right? More diverse teams lead to better outcomes. So,
yeah. I wanted to go back to the book. You mentioned you wrote a book in the very beginning called Geostrategy by Design. And
mhm.
the book kind of talks about how companies can position themselves for growth during an uncertain geopolitical future. So in our time today, we're really only kind of touching on some of the topics here, right? And we're not getting deep, and I'm sure the book goes deeper into some of this stuff. I'd encourage people to buy the books. You can get more in-depth knowledge in this and than what we can give you here. So go buy the book. It's available, I'm sure, everywhere you can find books. But I wanted to ask you if you might share a few of the insights from the EY geostrategy framework with our audience today that kind of you talk about in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, yeah, I could go on for quite a while, so I'll try to keep it brief. But yeah, essentially, we wrote the book because we recognize that, our company's operating environment has really shifted in some pretty fundamental ways, right? Like we've seen this shift from a more unipolar to a much more multipolar system, which means geopolitical power is more dispersed, which creates a more complicated environment for companies to manage. We've seen geopolitical relations, sort of broadly speaking, become somewhat less cooperative, a bit more conflictual. And we've seen that within countries around the world, policymakers aren't focused primarily on or only on economic outcomes. They're now much more focused on sort of security, national security outcomes than they had been in the past. So all of this leads to a really, complicated environment that needs to be very carefully managed by C-suites around the world. So what we do in our book is really sort of present a how-to guide for how to manage that risk. So how to have more confidence in leading your company into the future, even in this kind of uncertain geopolitical environment that we're in. So, there's really four parts to our EY geostrategy framework in terms of activities that companies need to do. So one is around identifying and monitoring the political risks that exist in the world. Then once you have that universe of political risks, it's really about assessing their potential impact on each individual company. So knowing where you could be hit, whether that's in supply chain or whether that's in sales and revenue or your talent or the finance and tax. So it's thinking broadly and holistically about where potential political risks could impact the company. So then once you have that, it's really around acting on those risks in two main ways. One is around sort of classic risk management, so mitigating the potential impact of downside risks, and positioning the company to seize potential opportunities associated with any upside risks that may exist. And then it's around really strategizing around political risk and incorporating, geopolitics and all these other factors into strategic decisions, whether that's market entry, global footprint, informing transactions. So those are really sort of the four components of the framework, and then underlying it all is a governance structure that really supports and connects all of these activities. Because, like we were talking about a few minutes ago, this environment that we're in really does require sort of cross-functional collaboration across a company in order to manage these risks effectively. So what we're really trying to do in geostrategy by design is to give executives the tools they need and the confidence to position their companies for success in this environment that we face.
Yeah. So go buy the book. That's the end result here. You get a lot more insights like that and deeper dives into each of those different areas as well. So go do that.
Exactly.
Want to ask you one final question before we wrap up here, and that is for companies that maybe don't have a geopolitical strategy at this point, about building one, right? And these issues are not going away. I think that's very clear, and we made that clear. So what advice can you share with companies on how to approach building a strategy, how to get started in this process?
Yeah, so our sort of starting point is actually what I ended on just a moment ago. It's
Okay.
about creating that governance structure that enables the proactive and cross-functional management of geopolitical risk. So in some companies, in smaller companies that may just be, a few individuals or one team. In larger global organizations, it may be a much larger sort of committee structure or however it makes sense within each company. The specific structure is less important than sort of the fundamentals of governance around geopolitical risk management, which is around ownership, communication, and trust. So essentially, once you set up that governance structure, which we've helped a variety of companies do in a variety of ways, then it's about those kind of getting those four activities that I mentioned around identifying risk, assessing it, managing it, and then strategizing around how to incorporate it into longer term planning. All of that works better if you get that governance structure right.
Yeah. Okay, great. Courtney, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. If people have specific questions or want to get in touch, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I enjoyed speaking with you. Really, the best way to probably get in touch is through EY's website. You can learn more about the Geostrategic Business Group, some of our latest insights, and there's ways to get in touch with me from there.
Great. Thank you. It was a pleasure to have you today. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Brian.
I want to thank my guest today, Courtney Rickert McCaffrey of EY, and all of you who took time out of your day to listen. I greatly appreciate it and you spending some time with us today. A new episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.